Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Everything Technology Podcast. I'm Bob O'Donnell, the host of the podcast and the founder and chief analyst and president at Technalysis Research. And in case you haven't joined us before, this podcast is all about the latest in tech industry news and analysis. I break things down, I talk about some of the big news of the past few weeks, and I tell you about what it means. We're going to talk about the news. So this week was actually quite exciting for me because I had my first business trip post-pandemic. We're not quite post-pandemic, but first chance I've had to go since the pandemic hit. And I flew out to Albany, New York, and drove up to Malta, New York, upstate New York, where GlobalFoundries had an event to announce that they were going to be adding new capacity to their chip-making fab there in Malta. That's the main U.S. fab that they have. And their existing Fab 8, they're going to expand, and then they're going to actually add an entirely new fab. Now, it's going to take several years before that happens, but the process has been announced. And of course, there's huge government support. In fact, Chuck Schumer was there to support it. He is, of course, the New York State Senator, but Commerce Secretary Raimondo was also there talking about the importance of semiconductor manufacturing to the U.S. So very interesting time. Of course, this happened just as the rumors of Intel potentially being interested in purchasing GlobalFoundries also happened. I don't think that's going to happen right away. Certainly, GlobalFoundries isn't talking about that. In fact, what they're focused on instead is doing an IPO next year. But super exciting news from GlobalFoundries, as you can hear.
This idea of rebranding the company was about us as a team committed to be bold, to make the kinds of investments, to create the technology for society. It's pretty much, it's going to double, maybe a little bit bigger, the clean room space. So depending on the technology mix we put here, you could get a little bit more in wafer output, but the intent is to get this to become roughly the scale of a mega fab.
Another reason I was there at the GlobalFoundries event was to moderate a panel on the automotive supply chain. Good morning, everybody. My name is Bob O'Donnell, and I'm the president and chief analyst at Technalysis Research, a tech industry market research firm, and I'm very pleased to be here today to host this panel with GlobalFoundries on the automotive supply chain and the elements involved in that. And of course, there are the tiers. It is in fact a multi-tiered supply chain, and we hear about tier ones and tier twos and the OEMs themselves. And of course, then GlobalFoundries in the role that they play. So the goal of this, I think, is to try and illuminate more people to what's involved, what are the challenges, what in particular has led us to the situation that we're in, and then what can be done to overcome some of those issues. One of the interesting things people have discovered, unfortunately, because of what's been happening with the pandemic and the huge demand for chips, is that there aren't enough of them. And GlobalFoundries actually makes a lot of chips for the automotive industry, but even still, we've seen situations where car makers have been idling plants or they've had to ship cars with certain features simply missing because they didn't have the chips that drive them. People don't realize now there can be hundreds of chips in a single car. And a few of them are cutting edge process technology based chips, which is not what GlobalFoundries makes, but they make, in fact, those things that are 12 nanometers and higher, which don't get as much attention, but are incredibly important to a huge number of industries, not only automotive, but the defense industry, lots of other things as well. In fact, there were a lot of folks from the U.S. government talking about the criticality of GlobalFoundries from a defense and other government application perspective as well. So very interesting event, exciting to be able to go and attend. Another big event this week was from Amazon. Amazon had their Alexa Live developer event. So those of you who've had an Echo or any other Amazon Alexa-based device know that you can add capabilities to an Alexa through what's called skills. Think of them as like audio-based applets. Of course, recently we've seen the introduction of the Echo Show and other devices that have Alexa that have built-in screens. So we're starting to see Amazon, of course, offer developers the ability to have screen-based applications as well. And they talked about that and the whole idea of what they called widgets. And widgets are little application screens that you can display on an Echo Show. and they give you information. And what's really interesting about them is it's obviously a different way to discover these types of skills. But in addition, they can be done proactively and they can just run in the background. They can gather information about the weather and other things so that all of a sudden you have a device that's much more proactive. And one of the interesting things about Alexa and this whole notion of ambient computing, that is this idea that you're going to have devices that simply know what you're interested in and provide that information to you through sensors and what have you, and then that you just talk to. Obviously, that's what you've typically done with Echo type devices. Um, is that they want to get smarter and more proactive. Up until now, you've had to really figure out ways to remember the key phrases that you have to say to trigger the device to work. Obviously, hey, Alexa, things like that are simple. But when you get into adding skills, very easy to forget what the exact skill words you need to trigger a particular skill. So we saw a lot of developments. They had over 50 new capabilities added to the Alexa platform. And some of them leverage something called name free interactions, or NFI. And the idea there is that if you say, hey, what's going on in the news, that can actually trigger a number of news related skills that don't necessarily have the word news, or if, in fact, require, to be honest with you, a more specific type of news, like naming the particular network that you want your news from, or that you want business news versus sports news, or what have you. So NFI, the concept there, name for interaction, is essentially to kind of get this device to basically do what you think, not necessarily what you said, or do what you meant and not what you said. And that, of course, makes things significantly easier. So that was a very important set of developments that we saw there. We also saw Amazon start to provide new ways for developers to monetize their skills. You could actually have skills that you have to pay for some very specific information. But there are other ones that allow you, of course, to shop on Amazon. Surprise, surprise. But there are other things that you could actually shop within an app and then get credit with like the Amazon Associates program. So they've got a number of interesting ways now to extend the monetization capability for app developers. The last little bits I wanted to talk about were two areas where Amazon is kind of extending their reach and working with others, which is also important because as cool as smart speakers and this whole concept of ambient computing has been, the reality is it's been a kind of a closed world. You kind of either buy into one ecosystem, like the Amazon ecosystem or the Google ecosystem or the Apple ecosystem, but it's been tough to get things to work together. So VII is the voice interoperability. I forget what the other I is. Anyway, it allows multiple voice assistants to work together. Theoretically, you could have one that was good at one thing and one that was good at something else. A more practical version of this is the fact that Samsung's next smart fridges, what they call their smart home hub, is going to have both Bixby, which is Samsung's voice assistant, and Alexa, and you can switch between them. The other idea with VII is you can actually have one voice assistant call another voice assistant kind of automatically. Adds a whole nother layer of complexity and capability to ambient computing. The other big thing that Amazon did was add support for Matter. Now, Matter is a protocol that's designed to make the discovery of multiple smart home devices easier. Again, especially ones that cross ecosystem lines. And this is a big deal because now we've got Apple, Amazon, and Google, amongst many others, supporting Matter. And so at Alexa Live, Amazon announced that just about all existing Echoes and Echo shows we're going to get Matter support. There will be an update that allow them to work with this Matter protocol, should make working with other devices significantly easier, and that's a big deal. Another thing I wanted to mention was actually an article I wrote for USA Today this week. I'll have a link in the bottom below the video here. The article was basically why it's going to be 10 times harder to return to the office than it was to leave the office. And it's kind of a huge topic because, of course, a lot of people are just starting to return to the office. I mentioned my first business trip. I've seen other folks on some of the Zoom and other calls I've been on recently be in the office. So companies are starting to deal with this. But what a lot of people are realizing is everybody thought, oh my God, how are we going to get people to be able to work from home? That's going to be super hard. And it was hard, but amazingly, it went really well. In fact, staggeringly well. And here we are, a year and a half after the start of the pandemic almost. And people have gotten a lot done. In fact, it's completely changed their work lives. And that's, of course, created a lot of interesting sort of philosophical questions about how people are going to deal with this. But there's practical issues as well in terms of how you get some people who are in the office and some people who are remote to work well together. Because it's a little awkward if you've been on some of these calls when you try to do that right now. It's great when everybody's sort of their Hollywood squares, kind of, Zoom square or WebEx square, or wherever it is. That works great. But when you've got a couple people who are there and a couple people who aren't, adds all kinds of problems. Anyway, fascinating subject. I encourage you to read the article. I think it raises some big questions. Lots of tech earnings this week as well that I thought I'd briefly touch on. We saw earnings from IBM had really strong numbers. I mean, in general, we saw very strong tech earnings all week from a whole bunch of different companies. IBM had some of their strongest revenue in quite some time. It's good to see they had 3% growth overall in revenue. But more importantly, they saw revenue growth in the areas they're starting to really focus more on, in cloud software and in AI-based software, and then services related to that. That's really important. I mean, you have to remember, IBM is hugely service focused. Yes, they sell a lot of software, but a lot of their business is services. And by the way, they still do sell mainframes because there's a lot of people, believe it or not, who still use those and other older systems. So interesting to see that from IBM. On Intel, big news from Intel was around the PC numbers. Huge PC numbers, 33% year over year growth PCs, absolutely enormous. And it's also interesting because the day before Intel, TI, Texas Instruments, had reported their earnings, and their forecast was not that great for the second half. And some people were saying, "Oh my gosh, are we already over this need for for semiconductors that's driven such strong growth?" But clearly, that TI was the anomaly. In fact, Pat Gelsinger, the CEO of Intel, talked about the fact that some of the chip shortages may last until 2023. And not only do they expect to see continued PC growth, but they're going to see some data center growth, which has been slow because there were some tough compares when at the very beginning of the pandemic, a lot of people bought servers to support the cloud. So that made for some tough compares, but they're seeing that business start to pick up and they think they'll see year over year growth in the second half. So that's big news as well. And then the last little item I wanted to talk about, I thought was a lot of fun, was from ARM. ARM has created a new plastic-based CPU, no silicon. They're using these oxide layers to basically print onto a plastic substrate. And what's fascinating about this, there have been flexible electronics in the past. It's not the first to do that, but it's the first to do a full-on CPU. And this is incredibly important because it's a 32-bit CPU, by the way, based on their A architecture, which is for microcontrollers and some smaller applications. But still, the point is, having it on plastic means you can put it in a lot of different places that you wouldn't be able to normally put a CPU. So for IoT-based applications, for everything like packaging and on putting it on devices like a toy that's curved or shaped oddly or whatever, there's all kinds of interesting things you can do with flexible packaging. So right now it's more concept than reality. They actually had it in the journal Nature that talked about this, a paper that they actually submitted apparently about 6 months ago, but was just published this past week. But really cool, really interesting way to think about what's happening in the future. So that'll be fun to watch. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in to this summer shortened version of the Everything Technology podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, if you like the program, like it, subscribe, check it out. Again, I've got the link to that USA Today article that I mentioned. Appreciate you tuning in, and I look forward to speaking with you again sometime soon. It's Bob O'Donnell signing off for the Everything Technology podcast. Thanks.